I happen to have the engine from a 2002 to 2005 Yamaha Vino 50cc two-stroke scooter up on the workbench today. And I was taking it apart for a totally different reason, but I realized that it's a completely stock engine and it still has the restriction and the variator. So I thought this would be a good opportunity just to show you how to remove that. Obviously this engine is just sitting on a workbench, it's not in a scooter, and I don't even have the entire scooter because I just bought this engine off of eBay. But the process for what I'm going to show you is no different if this engine is still in the scooter. All of this area here is where you'll be working, and you can access that easily while the engine is still installed in the scooter. So none of that changes. The first thing you'll need to do is remove this kickstart lever. That's held onto the shaft by a single bolt, so you need to remove that. You can either use a 10mm socket or wrench, or you can use a large Phillips or Japanese industrial standard screwdriver. And take that bolt completely out. If you're lucky, you may be able to just slide this off. Sometimes they're a little stubborn, and what you can do is take a small flathead screwdriver, something like that, and just stick it in right in this area here where you can see it split, and try to sort of pry it apart a little bit and then pull this off. So go ahead and remove the Kickstarter completely. Then you need to remove this plastic cover that goes on over the CVT cover, and it's held on by these two Phillips heads, screws or bolts. And when you're working with a Phillips head that are in most of these, they may actually work with Japanese industrial standard, but I don't have a screwdriver that large personally. But you'll want to use a number 3 screwdriver. Typical screwdriver Phillips head is a number 2, and they just don't quite fit in there as well as they should. Make sure you find a screwdriver with a head that has a nice snug fit in there. These things can be stubborn, so before I even start, what I like to do is put the screwdriver in there snug and just give the screwdriver a tap or two with a rubber mallet before I start turning the screws. Then the cover should just pull off. Now you need to remove the CVT cover. Again, this engine isn't totally intact. Normally you would have an air box here that attaches to these two bolts on the front, and you would remove those first. Then, just like I'll show you here, you've got a series of bolts all the way around the perimeter and one in the center here of the CVT cover, and all of those need to be removed. And for the most part, these are going to be 8mm head bolts. So you need an 8mm socket. This one here that connects to the starter ground wire requires a Phillips head. Then you can remove the CVT cover. That may not be quite as easy as it sounds like. What we hope for is that this basically just pulls off and comes right off. That doesn't always happen because there's a gasket that runs around the edge of here. Sometimes it'll stick to that. And also right under this area, there's a bearing, and a shaft sits inside that bearing, and sometimes that's a pretty secure or a pretty snug fit, so it may cause some resistance. So first go ahead and just try to pull it off and see if it comes off on its own. You can see at the front it wants to come off easily, but then at the back of the cover it barely wants to move. So what I do is I get a plastic or a rubber hammer or mallet, and I tap around the outer edges here of the CVT cover as I'm trying to remove it, just to try and break free any bond from the gasket or this bearing and the shaft in here. And that's tapping it, not hammering it or beating it, because this aluminum cover, you could actually break the thing if you hit it very hard. So you just want to tap as you try to remove it and kind of wiggle it around. So that got it off far enough that I can tell it's loose, and then I can just grab it and pull it the rest of the way off. And once the cover's off, take a look at your gasket and just make sure it's basically intact all the way around. You haven't ripped it all up. It's not falling apart or anything. You can replace it if it's not perfect. Personally, I don't do that because I don't really worry about this gasket as far as sealing air or water or anything, because a lot of times I will run a vented CVT cover. But if you want the gasket to be perfect and it's not, you may need to get a replacement gasket and do that while you're going through this process. Once the cover's off, you can just take a quick look at the CVT and tell that it's not functioning at its maximum potential from the travel that you get in the front and rear pulleys. So when you look at the front pulley specifically, you can see there's this line, and below this line there's wear from the belt. It's kind of glossy because the belt has been operating in this area. And then above that line there's no wear at all because the belt hasn't traveled that far out. And the further toward the outside edge of this pulley that the belt can travel, the more effective gear ratios basically the CVT can make. So the higher the top speed it could potentially see. When you look at the rear pulley, you can see that the belt doesn't sit toward the very outside of it either. And when the engine is at idle or at rest like it is now, the belt should sit as far out as it basically can on the rear pulley. And you can see there's quite a bit of room left. Now, the restrictor washer that we remove in the variator will not push this belt further out. That's a function of some different things. But it's important to note this and be aware of this, because if you can get the belt to travel further out toward the outside of the rear pulley, then that will give you a better, what we sometimes call first gear, or like a takeoff ratio, a better low ratio for the initial launch and acceleration. What this also does is it can affect the operation of the clutch, because it affects how fast the clutch is spinning. And if you've ever looked at aftermarket clutch springs, you know they're rated in RPM generally. So say you get plus 1000 RPM springs or something like that. So it's very important how fast this is spinning. And if you sort of change the ratio that this pulley is driven compared to the engine, then you can change how the clutch engages. So it's important to keep this as far toward the outside as you can for the best operation of the CVT. So in order to get to the restrictor, we've got to take off this variator fan or fixed half and everything in front of it. So to start with, we've got to take off this 17mm nut. There are actually quite a few ways to do this. What I prefer is to just use a 17mm socket and an impact and just zip it right off. You can also use a tool like this that's meant to hold the variator in place, and then use just a regular ratchet and socket. You could also get an adjustable holding tool like this, and it's just got pins on these arms here. The pins go into these holes on the flywheel. If you put them in there, then you can use that to hold the flywheel still while you use a ratchet and a socket on the variator to loosen the nut or tighten the nut as needed. If you do decide to use the flywheel holding method, there will be a fan on that has 3 screws that you'll need to remove, and then there's a cover that goes on this side, or a shroud, that has multiple screws to remove. So you've just seen me remove the nut, and now I'm going to pull off this washer and the starter gear that's behind it. So one thing that I've always found helpful when doing this kind of stuff is to line things up in the order that they come off of the crankshaft, and that way when I go to put it back together, I can just kind of follow the reverse order if I couldn't remember it. So in this case, I removed the nut first, then this washer came off, then this starter gear, and you can continue on that way as you take stuff off. So now I'm left with this star-shaped washer or key and the fixed half, and I just pull those off in one piece together, just holding my thumbs over the washer so it doesn't fall off. Once that's out of the way, you can see there are actually 2 different washers in here. There's one here sitting on the end of the drive boss, and then there's this big one that goes around the drive boss. I'm going to remove this belt just to give you a better look. You don't really have to remove it to take this off. Now you can see this washer will slide up and down on the drive boss here. Drive boss just being the center section kind of the variator that rides on this crankshaft. And this just sits on the very end of it. What I've noticed is that some people will take off both of these as restrictions, but they both aren't necessarily restrictions. So this washer here, you can just slide off. That is definitely a restriction. That is what I would call your restrictor washer. So this is how your variator would sit when it's at idle or at rest. The variator is as open as it can be, that way the belt can ride down toward the center of the variator, down toward the drive boss there. Then as you accelerate, the variator tries to close, and that pushes the belt up toward the outside edge of the front pulley. And the more it can close, the more it can push that belt outward. So you see you've got a lot of unused space on here. Clearly it's not being able to push the belt toward the outside edge very well. It's not closing well enough. Now if we take this restrictor or washer off of here, I can set it up again. So here you can see it doesn't change anything with how the variator sits when it would be at rest or at idle. It's still the same distance apart, although you wouldn't have that washer in the way. It could possibly restrict the belt from getting further down if that washer kept it off of the drive boss basically. But it doesn't change the actual distance that these two pulley halves are from each other at rest or at idle. But when you try to close them, normally it would have stopped about there because of the washer, but you get all this extra travel because that washer is no longer in the way. So the further you can get that closed, the higher it can push that belt toward the outside edge of these pulleys, and hopefully the better that will be for top speed. So that leaves us with this small washer, or you may want to more accurately call it a spacer or a shim in this case, that sits on the end of the drive boss. And effectively what that does is make the drive boss longer. So if this washer or spacer were larger than the diameter of the drive boss, it may actually stop the variator from being able to travel over it, and then that would be a restriction. In this case, it won't actually physically stop the variator from traveling over it. It can work out though that if your drive boss is too long, even by something like this, which is about 0.8 millimeters, that the two pulley halves don't get as close together as they should. They just don't want to travel the full distance, and then you don't actually get the same top speed out of it that you would if this weren't in place, because they're not in as ideal of a ratio there. So to me, this is sort of what I call a tuning item, because sometimes it works better when this is in place, and sometimes it works better when it's off. If you do want to remove it, you can see I just slid it right off of there. And it's no trouble to put it back in place either. So it's very easy if you wanted to try and play around with it just to see what it did for your tuning. So just to show you an example, I'll go ahead and put this back in place. And then I'm going to put everything back together real quick, and I'll show you the difference that it makes with and without this. So now I've got this reassembled with the spacer on the drive boss, and let's take a look at what that changes. Even though we've been working with the front pulley, I've zoomed in on the rear pulley because it's easier to show you what that spacer does. So I told you that the spacer can help the belt travel further down in the front pulley, but that also helps the belt travel further outward in the rear pulley, because obviously the belt is only a certain length. So what I'll do is take this marker, and I'm going to make a mark around the rear pulley so you can see right where the edge of this belt was with the spacer in place. So now I'll go ahead and remove this spacer and then reassemble everything, and I'll show you if that makes any difference. Now I've got everything back together without the spacer on the drive boss, and I've rotated the engine around multiple times to make sure the belt is sitting where it's actually going to sit at rest. And here's this mark that we made before with the spacer in place, and you can see, hopefully, that the belt actually can't make it up as far as that mark is. Since this belt will not sit as far outward on this rear pulley now, we have actually changed our takeoff ratio, so it actually doesn't have as good of what you could call a first gear for takeoff. And it also will spin the clutch at a different rate relative to the engine, so the clutch springs may actually engage at a lower RPM. So all of this could hurt your takeoff performance. So if you want the most out of it, you could try this both ways. You could try it with the spacer in place and without the spacer in place and find out what practical difference it makes for you on your scooter. If I had to guess, I would say you'll probably do better with that spacer left in place. And the reason is, if the scooter is totally stock, and most likely it is if you're just now getting to the restrictor, then you probably don't have the power to pull that much higher on the top end anyway. So you'll probably get more advantage that you'll actually see in the real world by just having better takeoff. Now I'll put my star washer or key back into the fixed half, and then I'll go ahead and slide that on over these splines on the crankshaft. And what I'll do then is squeeze the belt a little and make sure it's not holding the fixed half up so it can't go all the way in. Now you can take the starter gear and slide that on over the splines in the crankshaft. Before I move on, I do want to mention that if you remove that drive boss spacer, that little shim in there, you do change how deep all this stuff sits on the crankshaft. So if you happen to see that the crankshaft protrudes beyond where this kickstarter gear is, like the splines stick out of the kickstarter gear, then you'll need to remove this kickstart gear and put that washer here, put that shimmer washer right here behind the kickstart gear, and then reinstall the kickstart gear. And that way you'll keep the spacing the same for all this stuff. Now the washer can go on here, and then you can install a nut just finger tight for now. So the technically correct way to tighten this nut would be to hold the flywheel or use a variator holding tool here and tighten this nut with a torque wrench to 22 foot-pounds of torque. What I'm actually going to use is an impact gun and a torque stick to limit the torque that's applied to this. And you can get torque sticks in various specs, so just use one appropriate for what you're tightening. Before you tighten the nut all the way down, what you need to do is squeeze the belt so that it goes in toward the center of the rear pulley. And what that does is it creates a lot of slack in the belt. So then you can take the belt and kind of try to pull it toward the outer edge of the rear pulley, and that way the belt isn't holding the nut up, because you can actually tighten this nut against the belt and then it's not really tight, and next thing you know the nut comes off the first time you ride it. It can cause all kinds of damage. So make sure when you're tightening that you're not tightening against the belt. You can see after I've tightened, the belt's still loose in there, so I know I didn't tighten it down against the belt. Then I'll usually take the bottom of the belt and kind of push it toward the back, toward the rear pulley, just to put some tension back on the belt. And what that does is keeps the belt from being too loose and getting in the way when I'm trying to put the CVT cover back on. Now you should be ready to put the CVT cover back on, so just make sure these dowels are in place. There's one in this corner and one in this corner. Sometimes they'll stick inside of the CVT cover in these holes, but either way, just make sure they're either in here or in the cover, and then go ahead and line everything up and kind of pop that into place. You may need to give it some pops with your palm on the back to get it to slide over that shaft with a bearing. So we've got 4 different kinds of bolts that go into the CVT cover, and I'll start with the easiest one. That's this very long bolt, and that will go right into this hole here. The next one in my case is a silver screw, and it's got a Phillips head, and that one is the one that the ground wire goes over. So go ahead and put that through the ground wire, and then it goes right here in the bolt hole right next to your bearing here. Now you should have 2 of these longer bolts and I believe 7 of these shorter bolts. The longer bolts will go in 2 different corners. They go actually right where those dowels are to locate the CVT cover. They go in those corners. Then you can just kind of fill in all the other holes with these bolts. So just a quick tip, even if you can't remember exactly where these 2 different lengths of bolts were supposed to go, you can basically try them in their holes and figure out where they're supposed to go. So just for example, this is the bolt that should go here, and you can see I've got a little more than a 1/4 inch of the bolt sticking out there. And then if I went to put the bolt in that's way too long, I've got so much bolt sticking out there, it's obvious that's not what's supposed to thread in there. So all you really have to do is just go around and check how the bolts actually fit in the holes. After that, you can reinstall this plastic cover. Just make sure your foam's in place inside there and slide it on over the CVT cover. And then you should have these 2 bolts with sort of grommets built into them. To go ahead and install those and tighten. Now all that's left is to install your kickstart lever. So what you'll want to do is just slide that on over the spline so it's basically parallel with the top of your CVT cover. And the reason I'm telling you that is I used to actually install these kind of clocked up like this and thought it gave me a good kick. The problem with that is it will give you a good kick, but then it'll run into the stop and you'll actually end up breaking CVT covers if you keep installing them that way and just kick the crap out of it. So you're better off, in my opinion, just to leave them where they install them, basically at the factory. Like I said, roughly parallel with the top of the CVT cover. So make sure you've got that pushed on all the way, and then you can install the bolt in there and tighten that up. That should complete the job. So now you're probably ready to jump on the scooter and find out if it's going any faster for you or not. But before you run out the door, I would like to say thank you for watching. And if you've enjoyed the video or found it helpful to you, then please hit the like button.